our friends, colleagues, and students. I'd like to thank the Zakir Hussain College. It's indeed a great privilege to have the opportunity to speak on this subject in the presence of Justice Rajinder Sachar. Before I proceed, I think I just want to make one point of context, which is that fortunately in India, in the past decade or so, the debate on minorities has really gone beyond the constitutional debates in both government, in civil society, in the public domain. I think we've gone beyond that, and which is why I think what I'm going to do today is to focus on assessing what is it that has been done in the context of the changing contours of the debate. And as all of us are aware, of course, the debate changed with the government's very, very landmark decision of the Prime Minister and the United Progressive Alliance government in 2005 to appoint a high-level committee headed by Justice Rajinder Sachar to look into the socio-economic status of Muslims in India. The committee highlighted the deep deficiencies and deprivation of Muslim communities. The cabinet approved its recommendations, and the Ministry for Minority Affairs, which was set up in 2006, was designated as the nodal ministry to monitor its implementation. The report sparked a lively debate among political parties, academics, and civil society, and more generally, I think, in the Muslim community as well. This committee revealed that Muslims lagged behind in every aspect of socio-economic development, thus exposing the hollowness of the propaganda that they're being appeased. Most Muslims are, as we know, thanks to the Sachar Committee report, are much worse off because they benefit from no affirmative action. Their status in contemporary India, as was noted by this committee, was not very different from that of Dalits in the mid-20th century, which led to constitutionally mandated affirmative action in their favor. If we take 1947 as the baseline, Muslims have suffered in the past 60 years, in many respects, downward mobility. They're, in consequence, underrepresented in the political, administrative, and security structures of the state. You had to confront the issue of development deficit of minorities. That is because so far we've focused so much attention on identity issues, on communal politics, on communalism, communal violence, all of which are important, but just as important, and if I may say so, in my thinking, even more important are the development deficits, which have been completely neglected as a result of this exceptional focus on identity issues and communal violence. Now, the Sachar Committee led to a major shift in the focus of government's policies as it introduced, for the first time, a language of equality of opportunity and even anti-discrimination, evident in the recommendations for setting up of an Equal Opportunity Commission and a diversity index in public institutions. And this has been most evident in the run-up to the debates on the 12th five-year plan, which is just underway now. And that is whether the government should target Muslims qua Muslims or all 5 officially recognized religious minorities, or disadvantaged groups more generally, that is to say, not focus on minorities, and certainly not on Muslims among the 5 officially recognized minorities. Now, this issue then has been framed in public debates in terms of whether or not it is constitutionally appropriate to plan schemes along community lines or area, which is to say geographical area, or sectoral lines. Now, if we look at the UPA government, now clearly the UPA government in the past 8 to 9 years has placed, in a way, it has placed much greater stress on community-specific programs rather than mainstreaming minority development, which seems to be the central concern of this conference. And the government's, it is focused on community-specific programs because it believes that that is one way of enabling minorities and Muslims in particular to get an equitable share in finance, education, health services, and to bring them within the ambit of income and poverty-based programs. The second, of course, area, which again I'm not going to focus on, but it is worth mentioning, is of course, and I'm sure many of you, including the students present, are familiar with the Prime Minister's 15-point program. I think more interesting really is the multi-sectoral development program. Now, a special scheme called the Multi-Sectoral Development Plan was initiated in 90 districts, 90 districts with a high concentration of minorities, which is to say a population of at least 30% or more minorities, which may now be reduced, as you may have noted from recent recent debates in the run-up to the 12th five-year plan. The government might reduce that even to 20%. So this scheme was introduced in 90 minority concentration districts in 2008-9 for the development of minorities. Now, the multi-sectoral development plan is the largest ever program for the development of minorities since independence, directed at improving the overall parameters of minority concentration districts. Now, this was, of course, a follow-up to the Sachar Committee finding that Muslims are concentrated in locations with poor infrastructure, and therefore emphasis of government intervention should be infrastructure-related. The idea behind this MSDP was to address then the development deficit in minority concentration districts on the pattern, and I'm sure you're familiar with this program, which has been in place which is not for minorities, but which has been in place for now 30 years, the Backward Regions Grant Fund, or the BRGF, and the Rashtriya Sam Vikas Yojana, as also the Border Area Development Program. All of these programs are area development programs focused on backward regions. So the idea and the inspiration behind the multi-sectoral plan, much like these programs, is that minority concentration areas are also backward, and therefore you have to, like these programs, focus on the development of these areas. Now, let me come right away, and there is some assessment that has been made of these programs. I don't really have the time to go into the details, but suffice it to mention that for the most part, even though it is a little early to assess, but we're still talking of a program which has now been in place for about 5 years, 5 to 6 years. But for the most part, this program has been quite ineffective in alleviating the socio-economic deprivation of minorities, leave alone of Muslims. There's a clear dissonance between the identified development deficits of minorities and the interventions that have been rolled out for them. Poor access to basic services remains a major problem, public services, that is, in Muslim-dominated areas. The provision of electricity, drinking water is a major, sanitation is a major issue in Muslim-dominated areas, and you would be surprised to note that this is not earmarked in the multi-sectoral development program. This does not find none of these three that I've mentioned, that is to say electricity, drinking water, and sanitation, find any reflection in the priority list of needs identified for these districts. Now, efforts were made initially by districts and states to propose projects which were aimed specifically at Muslims, but significantly these were turned down by the Ministry for Minority Affairs, because it argued in an official note that everything has to be done to encourage and support the development of the area rather than the development of a minority, rather than target them at the community. So from the beginning then, this has been an area development program rather than targeting. Clearly, the idea, as far as I can see, is not necessarily to benefit minorities. Although this program is being done in their name, the idea is really to, as in the case of the Backward Regions Grant, is to simply promote the development of a region, and as the Ministry of Minority Affairs has repeatedly said in the past 6 years, everyone in that area should benefit from it, and not only minorities. But the idea is that there will be a trickle-down effect which will benefit minorities as well. Now, a critical issue then, in conclusion, is whether government programs should directly benefit individuals, households, and settlements of minorities and provide education, skills, livelihood, water, and sanitation to them, or should they focus on the development of the area? Now, it's clear that the government favors the second approach and was reluctant to go beyond the area development approach because of the fear that any minority-specific scheme runs the risk of being challenged in courts, whereas area development programs have not attracted any legal challenge. However, and I think this is something that I would like to underline, however, the Bombay, Gujarat, and Delhi High Courts have rejected 4 petitions that questioned the constitutionality of the merit-cum-means scholarship scheme that I mentioned earlier for students of minority communities. Indeed, these 3 courts ruled that these schemes do not violate the constitutional principles of equality or affect any of the fundamental rights guaranteed to the members of other communities. Now, this plan, as I said, is perhaps the most important government intervention to date. Now, but it's an intervention in the context of the Sachar Committee report, which really steers clear of targeting minorities and repeatedly makes the point that the Ministry of Law and Justice, and even in 2007, when the 11th plan was being discussed and the proposal for the sub-plan had come up, then too the Planning Commission had cited the Ministry of Law and Justice and said that the Ministry of Law and Justice has repeatedly raised objections to minority-specific proposals whenever these have been mooted, as the Constitution does not permit minorities to be treated favorably except with regard to cultural rights or rights relating to religion, culture, and education, and therefore any discrimination in their favor, which is what a minority sub-plan would be, any discrimination in their favor would be contrary to guarantees under Articles 14, 15, and 16 of the Constitution. And it was also pointed out by the Planning Commission and so on that in fact, the Ministry of Law and Justice has often even objected to some of the plans of the National Finance and Development Corporation for minorities on the same grounds that these are not universal in coverage. And there is an interesting study that has been done by the Center for Equity Studies. And this report is entitled Promises to Keep Investigating the Government's Response to the Sachar Committee report, and especially to the Multi-Sectoral Development Plan. And it has actually found that the multi-sectoral plan, far from benefiting minorities in the 3 states that they have examined, which is West Bengal, Bihar, and Haryana, 3 districts in these 3 states have actually found that the bulk of the benefits are going to the non-minority areas in the so-called minority concentration districts. Now, this, as I said, is something which is really quite extraordinary, and what this, of course, reflects are the obvious institutional biases and institutional prejudices, and the lack of political will to fight and resist these institutional prejudices and biases which stand in the way of the implementation of even the area development program. So 6 years after the submission of the Sachar Committee report, it's clear that not enough has been done on the ground. There are serious concerns with regard to institutional capacity, institutional prejudices, poor monitoring and coordination, and delays in fund releases. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2011 claimed that his government's initiatives have begun to impact the status of minorities. Referring to the persisting impression that the government had set up the Sachar Committee but was lackadaisical in implementing its recommendations, he boldly said that the reality was the opposite. And I quote him, he said, "I've often heard people comment that we've not implemented the Sachar Committee recommendations. I want to tell you today that this is not true at all. We've not only drawn up schemes and plans based on Sachar Committee recommendations, but these initiatives have begun to impact the status of minorities." But significantly, the Parliamentary Standing Committee, just a year ago, has rejected, which submitted its reports just a few months after the Prime Minister made this rather strong statement. The Parliamentary Standing Committee of the Ministry of Social Justice, looking after the Ministry of Minority Affairs as well, it rejected the government's claims that the government was according, as the Prime Minister said, high priority to the execution of the decisions taken on the Sachar Committee's recommendations. And the Standing Committee stated that the recommendations were not being implemented in a serious manner, and in fact it found serious lapses in the implementation of this program, and it actually found that of the 90 districts that had been identified, only 30 to 40 districts had actually even drawn up their plans. And hence the objectives of the inclusive agenda and inclusive growth, which seems to be the mandate of the 11th five-year plan, as indeed of the 12th five-year plan, which repeatedly talks of an inclusive economy, inclusive growth. The objectives of the inclusive agenda, at least relating to the Muslim minority, remains a work in progress. And I think it's very clear that most of these minority schemes are underperforming, and they need a boost. To be able to realize the objectives of the inclusive agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fundamental Rights chapter of the Part 3 of the Constitution specifically provides, by Article 25 to 30, the various rights and privileges of the minorities. That is, freedom of conscience, freedom to manage religious affairs, freedom to payment of taxes for promotion of any particular religion, freedom as to attendance at religious instruction, protection of interests of minorities, rights of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions. Of course, we've had a lot in the Supreme Court about the administration. However, more provision of rights can give no assurance by itself. It is for this reason that Article 32 guarantees to every citizen the right to move the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights. This article gives assurance to the minorities that their apprehension that a political process does not give them justice, they are not without a remedy. The Supreme Court made this clear in uncertain terms in the words of Chief Justice Das as far back as 1958, when he said, "We, the people of India, have given to ourselves the Constitution, which is not for any particular community or section, but for all. Its provisions are intended to protect all, minority as well as majority communities." One of the greatest tragedies in the unfortunate aspect of Babri Masjid demolition took place. The Supreme Court upheld the dismissal of 9 state assemblies which were part of the BJP and NDA thing, including even Simla, where no events had taken place, on the sole ground that secularism is the basis, objective, and foundation of our Constitution. Any state government violating the principle of secularism has no right to stay. That was a clear signal given, and 9 state governments were dismissed, notwithstanding that they had won with a majority, but that was not what was being accepted. Judicially, it has been held that minority means a community which is numerically less than 50% of the total population. Minority, as defined by European standards, would mean a group which is smaller in number from the rest of the population of a state, whose members, although nationals of the state, have ethnic, religious, or linguistic features different from those of the rest of the population, and are guided by the will to safeguard their culture, traditions, religion, or language. Of course, in the question of linguistic minorities, there are, of course, religious minorities like Muslims, Sikhs, Christians in India, but they do not necessarily share the same language or culture. Thus, a Kerala Muslim is a part of a linguistic group of Malayalam, speaking of which even a Hindu is a part, as their culture is also different from that of the Muslims of UP. Similarly, Punjabi Hindu and Sikh and even Muslims of West Pakistan have different religions, but the language and culture is very common. Punjabi has incorporated vocabulary from Persian, while Malayalam has Sanskrit words. For that matter, is not the language of Urdu of UP common to Hindus, Muslims. Punjabi Hindus and Sikhs share a common legacy, while a Karnataka or Tamilian Muslim cannot even speak Urdu. He may be a co-religious of North Muslim, but is a linguist majority in those states, while a North Indian Muslim and a Hindu is a linguist minority in those states. We have followed the word ethnic, and therefore we always bring it in saying ethnic minorities. Now, I may be wrong, and frankly, I'm very apprehensive of saying in presence of two stalwart professionals, academicians, and learned people. But my own thing is that India is not a multi-ethnic nation. Possibly there may be small ethnic groups in the northeast, but in the rest of the country, ethnicity is the distinguished feature of religion and language. But there's a confusion in equating ethnic with religious minorities. This is a concept borrowed from the West, where colonization by the European countries of Africa and Asia in fact brought forth the question of local and indigenous peoples of a colony being exploited by a ruling class which had come from outside. Thus, native Indians in the USA, Aborigines in Australia, New Zealand, Canada are ethnically different. But in India, no doubt, we are a multi-religious, multilingual people, but our ethnicity and race is the same.